I watched the Gabby Petito documentary and I had just a few thoughts. As always with topics as heavy as this one, I will put some resources if this is a topic that hits close to home for you in the description box. And without further ado, let's talk about 5 quick takeaways from the documentary. So the documentary does show sort of the typical trajectory of an abusive relationship, love at first sight, kind of sounds like love bombing in some situations, moving very quickly in a relationship, such as how Gabby quickly moved in with Brian's family in Florida, the isolation and possessiveness that Brian seemed to be increasing, like stealing her wallet because he didn't want her to go hang out with her friend, alternating between the honeymoon phase and the explosion phase of the abusive cycle, putting her down, belittling her job, positioning himself like a victim when she has her own life, contacting her mom to get better control over her. Like, there were some things that were touched on that was like, okay, this is indicative of what abuse usually looks like in a relationship. But aside from that, because I think a lot of people on my channel already know what encompasses abuse, I want to talk about just 5 quick takeaways from this documentary. Number 1 is that the average person, including the average law enforcement officer, is a fool when it comes to recognizing abuse and falling prey to DARVO. Most people are just so ill-equipped to figuring out who is actually the aggressor and who is the victim in a dynamic. We see this over and over again with pop culture examples. If you're not familiar with DARVO, it stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. It is when an abuser will basically try to flip the roles, act like the victim is the one victimizing them. And we saw a really chilling example of DARVO in the police cam footage where Brian was framing him hitting Gabby as self-defense, whereas she, on the other hand, when she was talking to the police, she was taking on more than her share of responsibility. So when you see this from the outside looking in, somebody saying, this person actually victimized me, and that person taking responsibility for victimizing them, it's so simple to think, oh, well, this is clear cut. This is the victim. This is the aggressor, without realizing that the aggressor is always going to sneakily flip the roles. And the actual victim is usually going to take on more than their fair share of the responsibility. And the thing that still to this day infuriates me is how the police assumed that she was the aggressor in that situation, and how unequipped the police are to assess for abuse. The documentary talks about how, I believe as a result of the Gabby Petito case, but I could be wrong, Utah passed a law where law enforcement officers are required to ask 11 questions when they suspect DV might be at play. So this includes questions like, did the aggressor ever use a weapon against you or threaten you with a weapon? This is an important risk factor because if someone has access to firearms, then, that is much more likely to cause actual bodily harm to a person. Do you believe that the aggressor will try to unalive you? That one is also really important because oftentimes the best predictor of whether a conflict is going to escalate is the victim's beliefs. We all have this intuitive understanding based on a person's past behavior, how they're going to behave in the future. And so sometimes the best way to figure out, is this person in imminent risk, is to ask them, do you think you are an imminent risk? Has the aggressor ever choked or attempted to choke you? This one is important because I can't remember the exact statistic, but of women who are unalived by their partners, being choked was a very clear risk factor leading up to that incident. Did you leave or separate from the aggressor after you were living together or married? This one's important to ask because the most dangerous time in a victim's life is when they choose to remove themselves from the abuser. So it's a start, it's a start to get law enforcement to start asking these questions to gain a sense of risk. But man, do we have a long way to go? Do we have a long way to go in terms of people actually understanding abuse and not falling prey to DARVO? Number 2, abusers are quick to deflect blame. Victims are quick to take on more than their share of the blame. Like I said, in the police cam footage, the heartbreaking part was that Gabby admitted fault. She took responsibility. She self-pathologized. She was saying I have OCD, I have really bad anxiety, which I don't even know if that's true. The documentary didn't go into her mental health history at all. It could have been something she was just simply self-diagnosing with, or something that Brian had told her she had as a way to invalidate or gaslight her. Victims are often so quick to take responsibility, to position themselves as the one that should have done better. Something that's often very valuable in other situations, the ability to take responsibility for yourself, to try to do things better next time. That's awesome in other situations. But in a situation where you have an abuser pretending to be the victim, that is not helpful. That is going to be used against you. And we really see how this was juxtaposed with Brian running away from accountability over and over again, whether it meant trying to stage the scene of the crime, fleeing the scene of the crime, running to mommy and daddy's house, then running away into the woods, and then eventually the final thing he ever did to himself. All of these are forms of running away, of not taking responsibility, of not being able to live with the consequences of his actions. Number 3, the nice guy abuser will always find a way to frame himself as a good guy, even to himself. I thought it was interesting that Gabby's parents initially described Brian as quiet and polite, and in his last note that he ever left, I was struck by how he was trying to make it seem like he did the moral thing. He took away Gabby's pain. Even in his very last moments, he tried to position himself as a victim, as some sort of suffering martyr. He claimed that Gabby was injured to no fault of his own, and that he took her life because he thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted. He wanted to take away her pain. I genuinely think that Brian thought he was a good guy, and I think a lot of abusers convince themselves of that. But choosing to take someone's life is an act of entitlement. You think you have the right to take someone's most basic human right. That is entitlement at its peak. And entitlement is, of course, an aspect of narcissism. And trying to constantly position yourself as a victim is a sign of particularly vulnerable narcissism. Number 4, behind every abuser is an enabler. In this case, there were certain things about the documentary that made me wonder about the relationship between Brian and his mom, and whether there might have been some emotional at play. Now, it wasn't a lot of evidence that they mentioned, so I don't know if this is really true, but it was just enough to make me wonder if this was maybe something that was happening in that home. If you're not familiar, emotional incest is when a parent treats one of their children almost like a sort of proxy romantic interest. I thought it was interesting how the mom was initially supposed to be sweet to Gabby and then started kind of mistreating her, resenting the time that Gabby spent with her son, feeling unappreciated, trying to punish them through the silent treatment. And if this is true, emotional incest is a form of trauma. It is something incredibly damaging. And although we didn't see, whether Brian Laundrie had any extensive trauma history, if there was emotional incest going on between him and his mom, it does provide a little bit more context into why he became an abuser, because hurt people hurt people. And that doesn't excuse what he did, and I think it's convenient to just, often blame it on the woman, blame it on the mom of an abuser. No, Brian did what he did because of his own actions. He's the one that needs to be held accountable, unfortunately, despite not having the opportunity to do that. But this documentary also does a really good job showing how enablers perpetuate the problem. Even in the way his parents protected him after he came home, the way they didn't cooperate with law enforcement. I found myself wondering, did they experience any sort of consequence for that? Were they, prosecuted for anything? Because it certainly seems like they should have been. And then there was, of course, the letter that Brian's mom sent to him, where she said, "I just want you to remember I will always love you, and I know you will always love me. You are my boy. Nothing can make me stop loving you. Nothing will or could ever divide us, no matter what we do or where we go or what we say. We will always love each other. If you're in jail, I will bake a cake with a file in it. If you need to dispose of a body, I will show up with a shovel and garbage bags. If you fly to the moon, I will be watching the skies for your re-entry. If you say you hate my guts, I'll go get new guts. Then she includes a Bible scripture, and then she says, nothing can separate us, not hatred, not hunger, not homelessness, not threats, not even sin, not the thinkable or unthinkable can get between us, not time, not miles and miles and miles. Obviously, this is a very disturbing letter. It really speaks to the lack of boundaries, the enmeshment between them. It speaks to the codependency, how she's willing to, shield her son from the consequences of his own actions. A type of unconditional love that honestly makes me wonder, how much compassion should we have for parents in this position? Because on one hand, it's completely understandable that as a parent, you want to protect your child, you love them as close to unconditionally as humanly possible, and you would do anything to protect them. But at what point do you cross a line where that unconditional love becomes enabling? I can't help but wonder if maybe she wouldn't have had any need to enable her son if she had been a healthier parent, a parent who had less enmeshment, who had clearer boundaries and consequences for her child. And number 5, social media has given us a front row seat to reaction formation. If you're not familiar with reaction formation, it's basically when you are dealing with an unacceptable feeling within yourself and you try to outwardly portray the exact opposite of that feeling. So for example, I as a person tend to catastrophize a lot. My mind immediately goes to the worst case scenario. So I make up for that with optimism. And I champion optimism a lot on this channel for that reason. It's basically a reaction formation. Narcissistic grandiosity is a reaction formation to actually deep unconscious self-loathing that narcissists have. Knowing what we know now about Gabby and Brian, when we see the behind-the-scenes footage of their vlog, there's this awkward performativeness to it. And I think we see this so often with social media, this demonstration of reaction formation. The good guy feminist is outed for sexual harassment. The Mormon mom who spews homophobic rhetoric is accused by her daughter of being in a gay relationship. The awesome mommy vlogger is outed for mistreating her child. The couple constantly posting lovey-dovey things about each other on social media is secretly cheating on each other. How can we discern on social media between someone overcompensating versus someone genuinely embodying their values in a way that bleeds over to their social media presence? Because there are situations where, a person's going to show up embodying what they truly love and what they truly believe in and what they truly feel. And it's not that they're overcompensating for it. It's just that shows up, like I talk constantly about my cats and loving my cats. It's not an overcompensation. I fucking love my cats, and that's going to show up in day-to-day life. So how can we discern between those moments when someone is truly just embodying their authenticity versus when someone is overcompensating for something? Pay attention to their actions over their words. And this is hard to do on social media because oftentimes on social media, all you have to go off of is somebody's words or somebody's script or somebody's carefully curated vlog. But generally, are you able to get a sense of how are they treating the people in their life? Are they embodying the values they preach about? More than just saying they have those values, are they actually living them? Who are they when no one's watching? Are they somebody that needs to make a big deal about every time they donate? Or are they a person who donates quietly without letting anyone know? Again, this is hard because you just can't know that with social media. Like you can't know what someone's doing in the privacy of their own time. But in general, just try to pay attention more to what people are doing rather than what they're saying. Also pay attention to when people keep repeating something as if they're trying to convince themselves. Like oftentimes I'll hear strange parents say, I'm a good mom, or I was a really good mom. I did the best I could. I was a good mom. I was a good mom. Which is interesting because firstly, that's not productive. Putting these black and white labels on your parenting is not conducive to any sort of rupture repairs or taking responsibility. It can actually be a form of defensiveness. But also when I hear something like that, it's like, who are you trying to convince? Are you trying to convince me or are you trying to convince yourself? Also in reality TV shows, you'll see on Love is Blind, for instance, the cameraman will ask them a question and they'll say like, I do love him. Yeah, I do love him. I love him so much. And it's just kind of like, why'd you say it like that? Why'd you say like, I do love him, almost as if you're trying to convince yourself. Sometimes people really do say what they mean, but if it feels like that person has something to prove, or they keep repeating something over and over and over again, or you're getting the sense they're trying to convince themselves, make a note of it. Also, listen to your intuition when something feels like it's over the top. Like with excessive PDA, for instance. Look, I have no issue with PDA in general. I love holding my husband's hand in public. I love hugging him. I love kissing him every now and then. But there are times when I'll be with somebody and the PDA they're exhibiting is just so over the top that it just feels like, what are you trying to prove exactly? You know what I mean? And your intuition will sometimes signal that to you. We have a pretty good built-in BS meter because it helps us survive. Listen to it. And lastly, time will tell. Especially with things like social media, if you're trying to figure out, is this a reaction formation or is this somebody genuinely embodying who they are, showing up as their authentic self? The truth comes out in the end. And sometimes all you can really do is just wait it out and see. So those were my 5 takeaways from the Gabby Petito documentary. The average person is a fool when it comes to abuse and DARVO. Abusers are quick to deflect blame, while victims are quick to take on more than their share of the blame. The nice guy abuser will always find a way to view himself as a good guy. Behind every abuser is an enabler, and social media has given us a front row seat to reaction formation. Let me know what you thought about the documentary if you've seen it. Again, I have put resources in the description box if this is something that hits close to home for you, which I really hope it doesn't. But if it does, you deserve so much better. Let this case be a lesson to you that you deserve to live and to not be in this situation, and to get yourself to safety as quickly as possible. I hope you have a nice rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.